to a set table, a romantic dinner, and a husband who looked ready to kill me. He wasn't holding a bouquet. He was holding the police report for my arrest. The dinner table was set for 3, just like it had been every night for the last 4 years. I had spent 2 hours slow roasting a brisket, the scent of rosemary and garlic hanging heavy in the air. My husband, Mark, was still at the office, but Leo, my 17-year-old stepson, was already seated, his eyes glued to his phone, his posture radiating that specific, sharp-edged teenage resentment I had never quite managed to penetrate. I placed a glass of wine at Mark's spot and sat down, smoothing my apron. "He'll be home in 10 minutes, Leo. Why don't you put the phone away? It's a nice night." Leo didn't look up. He didn't even blink. He just tapped his screen with aggressive precision, his thumb moving a mile a minute. "Whatever," he muttered. That was the extent of our dialogue these days. Since Mark and I had married, I had tried everything to bridge the gap. The weekend trips, the private tutoring, the forced family game nights. But Leo treated me like a hostile intruder in his home. I was the woman who had replaced his mother, the interloper who dared to rearrange the living room furniture. I was used to the cold shoulder. I wasn't prepared for the malice. The front door clicked open, and Mark's heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his face pale under the foyer lights. When he entered the kitchen, he didn't kiss me. He didn't even acknowledge the food. He walked straight to the table, his eyes fixed on Leo. "Is it true?" Mark asked, his voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't identify. Leo finally put his phone down. He looked at me, then at his father, his expression carefully crafted into one of profound, tremulous hurt. "I told you I didn't want to say anything, Dad. I didn't want to cause trouble." I felt a sudden, icy knot form in my stomach. "What's going on, Mark?" Mark pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and tossed it onto the table, sliding it toward me. My hands shook as I opened the clasp. Inside were photos, grainy, low-light screenshots of text messages, and a single printed document, a bank transfer authorization for $50,000, signed with my name, my forged signature. "Leo says you've been draining his college fund to pay off personal debts," Mark said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "He says you threatened to kick him out if he told me. Is that what we're doing now, Sarah?" I stared at the document, the ink looking terrifyingly real, the bank logo crisp and official. "Mark, this is insane. I have never seen this account in my life. I have my own money. I don't need—" "Save it," Mark cut me off, his eyes flashing with a betrayal so deep it looked like hatred. "I checked the account this morning. The money is gone, and according to the access logs, the transfer was initiated from your laptop." I stood up, my chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "My laptop? I haven't touched my laptop all day. I've been cooking, I turned to look at Leo. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. His lips weren't curled in sadness anymore. They were pulled back in a thin, cold smile of triumph. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, blinking drive, and set it on the table. "I didn't want to do this, Sarah," Leo whispered, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "But I have the surveillance footage from the living room camera. The one you didn't know I installed last week for home security. It shows you logging in. It shows you everything." Before I could reach for the drive, the house phone rang. A sharp, shrill intrusion that made us all jump. Mark picked it up, listened for a moment, and turned a shade of gray that frightened me more than the accusations. "It's the police," Mark said, his hand shaking as he held the receiver toward me. "They say they have a warrant for your arrest." "The police?" I repeated, the word tasting like bile. "Mark, don't you dare let them in. This is a setup. Look at him." I pointed at Leo, who was now leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed, a picture of calm detachment. He looked like a spectator watching a movie he'd already seen a dozen times. Mark didn't look at me. He kept his back turned, his shoulders hunched as he murmured something into the phone, an address, a confirmation. He hung up and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, blocking my exit. His face was a mask of rigid, wounded pride. "They're 2 minutes away, Sarah. If this is a mistake, you can tell it to a judge, but I'm not harboring a criminal." A criminal? I felt the air leaving the room. I tried to push past him, heading toward the hallway to reach my phone, but Mark grabbed my wrist. His grip wasn't the loving touch I'd grown used to. It was firm, corrective, and bruising. "Don't move," he commanded. You're actually going to let them take me? I shouted, my voice cracking. Your own wife, based on a thumb drive handed to you by a kid who hasn't spoken to me civilly in 4 years. Think, Mark, when have I ever cared about money? I paid for our anniversary trip. I paid for the new kitchen renovations. Why would I steal from a college fund I've been actively contributing to? Leo sighed, a theatrical, condescending sound. She's good at playing the victim, Dad. That's what she does. She told me she was in trouble with a gambling site. She said if I told you, she'd make sure I never made it to my senior year of varsity baseball. The lie was so specific, so perfectly tailored to hurt, that I was momentarily struck dumb. I lunged toward the table to grab the drive, desperate to see what kind of deep fake or manipulated footage he had cooked up, but Leo was faster. He snatched the drive and shoved it deep into his pocket. Get away from him, Mark barked, stepping between us. Just then, the blue and red lights began to dance against our living room windows, casting distorted, strobing shadows across the walls. The doorbell rang, a persistent, jarring sound that signaled the end of my life as I knew it. Mark, please, I begged, tears finally spilling over. Check my laptop. Look at the history. Look at the IP address. If you trust this boy more than you trust our life together, then we've been dead for a long time. Mark looked at me, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of deceit. For a split second, I saw a crack in his resolve, a glimmer of the man who had promised to love me through everything. Then he looked at Leo, who was now effectively sobbing, his face buried in his hands. I'm sorry, Sarah, Mark whispered, though it sounded more like an apology to himself. He turned and walked to the front door, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my stepson. As soon as Mark was out of sight, the tears vanished from Leo's face. He stood up slowly, smoothed his shirt, and walked over to the kitchen island, leaning in close enough that I could smell his cologne, the expensive brand I had bought him for his birthday. You think you're smart, don't you? He whispered, his voice cold and devoid of any youth. You think you can just come into this house and push me out of my spot? My dad doesn't even remember what his life was like before you showed up. He's tired, Sarah. He just wants peace. And once you're in a holding cell, he's going to realize that peace is exactly what he has. Why? I hissed, trembling with rage. I've done nothing but try to love you. Leo smirked, reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. Not the one he'd been using earlier, but a burner. He tapped the screen and held it up to my face. It was a live feed of our hallway. I watched on the tiny screen as 2 uniformed officers stepped into our foyer, their heavy boots tracking mud onto our hardwood. Mark was speaking to them, pointing toward the kitchen. Because, Leo said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper, I found the divorce papers you were planning to serve him, the ones you left in the bottom drawer of your desk. You didn't think he'd take the house, did you? You didn't think he'd take the money? Well, you're not getting either now. My heart stopped. I hadn't filed those papers. I hadn't even written them. Before I could process the insanity of his claim, the kitchen door swung open. The lead officer stepped in, his hand hovering near his holster, his gaze locking onto me with cold, professional detachment. Sarah Miller? He asked, his voice booming in the quiet room. You're under arrest for grand larceny and identity fraud. As he reached for his handcuffs, I caught a glimpse of Mark behind him, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated loathing. But then, my eyes darted to the corner of the kitchen, to the wall where the smart home hub was mounted. A small red light was blinking in a rhythm I hadn't noticed before. I suddenly realized that the home security system Leo was so proud of didn't just record the living room, it recorded the kitchen too. And if I could just get to the cloud server, I could prove everything. But as the officer grabbed my arm, he pulled me toward the door, dragging me past the hub, and as I walked by, I saw Leo hit a button on his burner phone. The red light on the hub turned a solid, dead gray. Everything, the footage, the logs, The truth was being wiped in real time, and I was being dragged out into the night. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow as the officers shoved me toward the back of the cruiser. My heels caught on the edge of the driveway, forcing me to stumble, but they didn't slow down. They weren't just arresting me. They were treating me like a dangerous criminal who had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. "Wait!" I shrieked, looking back at the house. Mark was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh yellow porch light. He looked like a stranger, a man I had shared a bed with for years, now a man who viewed me with the same clinical disgust one might reserve for a poisonous insect. "Mark, look at the hub. He's wiping the drive. Ask him why he's wiping it if he's telling the truth." Mark didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He just pulled the door shut, locking it with a sharp, final click. The officer pushed my head down and shoved me into the back seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud that signaled the end of my autonomy. As the car pulled away, I watched our house shrink into the distance. Through the rear window, I saw Leo standing at the kitchen window, watching the car disappear. He wasn't crying anymore. He was holding his phone up, recording my departure, a predator savoring the kill. The drive to the precinct was a blur of neon signs and shadows. My mind raced, clawing for a way out. If the digital evidence was being wiped, I was doomed. Unless the cloud wasn't just on the hub. I had set up the smart home integration myself. The backups were mirrored to a remote server I'd kept separate for security reasons when we first moved in. Leo was a smart kid, but he was arrogant. He thought wiping the local drive was the same as deleting the existence of the data. He didn't know about the off-site handshake. But I couldn't reach the server from the back of a police cruiser. I needed the lawyer, and I needed access. When we arrived at the station, the atmosphere was chaotic. It was a Friday night, and the precinct was humming with the frantic energy of a city that never slept. I was processed like a piece of luggage, fingerprinted, photographed, and stripped of my jewelry. The officer in charge, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Sergeant Miller, didn't even look at me when she read my charges. "Grand larceny, identity theft, and obstruction of justice," she recited, her voice monotone. "You'll get a phone call, then you go to the holding cell until your arraignment on Monday." "I need to talk to my husband," I pleaded. "He's been manipulated. There is evidence of my innocence on our home server." "Save it for your attorney, sweetheart," she interrupted, pointing me toward a row of metal benches. "And keep your voice down." I sat on the cold bench, my hands shaking. I realized then that my phone had been seized as evidence. I had no access to the remote server, no way to reach the cloud, and no way to prove that the identity theft was a fabrication. I leaned my head against the cinder block wall, my breath hitching in my throat. I was alone, labeled a thief, and being systematically erased from my own life. An hour later, a public defender named Arthur, a man who looked like he'd been sleeping in his suit for 3 days, approached the bench. He didn't look hopeful. "Ms. Miller, I'm Arthur. I've reviewed the initial reports. The DA has a copy of a bank transfer authorization, a set of text messages showing you discussing getting out from under the debt, and a video file that supposedly shows you at your laptop at the exact time of the transfer." "It's a lie," I whispered, gripping his forearm. "Arthur, please. You have to go to the house. You have to get a warrant for his devices. He's deleting the evidence as we speak. If you don't get the server, the truth dies tonight." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "A warrant takes time, Sarah. You're looking at a felony charge that carries a minimum of 5 years. If you want to plead down, we might be able to—" "I am not pleading guilty," I snapped, the fire of indignation cutting through my terror. "I want you to call my husband. Tell him to look at his phone. I sent him a message this morning, a normal message about dinner. It has a metadata stamp. It shows I was at the grocery store, not the house, when those transfers were initiated. Just call him." Arthur looked at me, a flicker of doubt finally crossing his face. "I'll try, but don't count on it. He's the one who called the police, Sarah. He's not going to want to hear from your lawyer." He walked away, leaving me in the silence of the holding room. I watched the clock on the wall tick down, every second feeling like a nail in my coffin. Then, the door to the holding area opened, and Sergeant Miller walked in, holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside was my phone. "Your husband called," she said, her voice dropping to a strange, hushed tone. "He says he has more evidence to turn over. He's on his way here." My heart soared. He had realized the truth. He had looked at the timestamps. He had seen the reality of the situation. I stood up, ready to be vindicated, ready for the nightmare to end. "Bring him in," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. The sergeant looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mix of pity and cold finality. She opened the door, but it wasn't Mark who walked through. It was Leo. He was wearing his father's coat, looking far too small for it, and in his hand he carried a second, larger evidence bag. Inside that bag was a set of bloody clothes, the blouse and skirt I had worn to work the day before, and a kitchen knife with a dark, stained blade. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Leo said, his voice carrying clearly into the room as he looked toward the doorway. Mark followed him in, his face ghostly pale, his eyes fixed on the evidence bag. "She didn't just steal the money, officer," Mark said, his voice breaking. "She tried to kill him when he found out." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. I stood frozen, my mouth hanging open, unable to form a single sound. The absurdity of it was suffocating. Bloody clothes? A knife? It was so far removed from reality that for a split second, I wondered if I had slipped into a fever dream. "That's not mine," I finally managed to gasp, my voice sounding like grinding gravel. "That is not my blood, and that is not my knife. Mark, look at me. Why are you letting him do this?" Mark wouldn't look at me. He kept his gaze pinned to the floor, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He looked broken, a man who had been hollowed out by a tragedy he couldn't comprehend. "She was always so volatile," Leo murmured, his voice trembling with a calculated, chilling softness. He stood just behind his father, his hand resting on Mark's shoulder in a gesture of twisted comfort. "She'd get these fits of rage when the money ran out. I tried to talk her down, I really did. But when I showed her the bank statements, she grabbed the first thing she could find." "I was at work," I screamed, lunging toward the bars of the holding cell. "Check my GPS. Check the office security cameras. I was in a meeting at 3 o'clock. I haven't been in that kitchen since breakfast." The sergeant didn't even flinch. She stepped forward, her eyes hard and judgmental. "Your office building reported a server glitch this afternoon, Ms. Miller. The security footage for that floor was corrupted between 2 and 4. It's all a bit too convenient, isn't it?" My blood turned to ice. Corrupted. Leo hadn't just been playing with our home network. He had been systematically dismantling my alibi from the outside in. He was better at this than I could have ever imagined. He wasn't just a bitter teenager. He was a master of digital manipulation. "Mark," I begged, my voice dropping to a raw, desperate whisper. "Think about the day we met. Think about what we built. You know I don't have a violent bone in my body. Please, just ask him where he got those clothes. Ask him why he has a spare key to my office building." Mark finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and